Welcome to this week's chapter recap. We're taking a look at 1 Samuel chapter 13 through to 2 Samuel chapter 7. My name's Corie. I'm with Bible Discovery and Bible Discovery TV. I'm here with my husband, Matlock, and each week we do a chapter-by-chapter recap of the assigned reading because we're reading through the Bible this year, the entire Bible. So it goes pretty fast. So this is just our effort to try to help you keep up with your weekly reading. So let's just jump right in.
Let's do it.
You ready?
Yeah, I'm always in.
Okay. 1 Samuel chapter 13. So we get an overview of Saul's reign in 1 Samuel chapter 13. So basically, Saul was 30 years old when he became king, and he ruled for 42 years. So that means he was 72 when he finally died in battle. That's a decent age for an older person, living in that time period, having, a life in battle the way that he did. We also meet Saul's son, Jonathan, and he is presented to us as pretty awesome, pretty fearless right away. Also in chapter 13, we see Saul, importantly, get rejected as king by the priest and prophet Samuel. And his rejection is based off of Saul offering an unlawful sacrifice to God. And when you dig into this, it's really easy to see, both sides of the story. It's easy to see, humanly speaking, why Saul did what it is that he did. But it was still wrong of Saul to do what he did by him overtaking the job of the priest and the prophet. He was going way beyond what he was anointed to do. So this rejection makes sense. So we're also told in 1 Samuel chapter 13 that the Philistines, the people group of the Philistines, had begun a full force attack on Israel. And their strategy was to take away weapons from any Israelite territory. So in Israel, weapons became extremely rare. So that's the amount of control that the Philistines had over Israel. So significant amount of control. 1 Samuel chapter 14, we get some of Jonathan's warfare is described here. And we see, again, him being very brave, very valiant, and very successful as a warrior, and very upright and leaning on God. We also read about questionable war choices made by Saul. So he's starting to go off where at the beginning of his reign, he's making good choices and sound military choices. And now they're starting to become questionable. 1 Samuel chapter 15, we see Samuel acting in his role as prophet, and he tells Saul to go battle against the Amalekites. He tells him, when you're battling the Amalekites, don't take anything, burn it all. So don't take any loot or any plunder. There should be nothing left. It's a judgment. This is a judgment battle. But Saul doesn't do that. He allows the troops to keep some of the best goods back. And his excuse is that they're going to offer them as burnt sacrifices to God. But the problem is that's not what God told Saul to do. Mm-hmm. He said, burn them right away. And now they're keeping them and they're keeping the king alive. And it's not going well. And I wanted to read to you Samuel's response to Saul when Saul's like, we're just keeping them so that we can burn offerings to God. What's the harm? And Samuel says this in verses 22 and 23. Does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as in obeying the Lord? To obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed is better than the fat of rams. For rebellion is like the sin of divination, and arrogance like the evil of idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you as king.
There's a lot to explore there in that line.
A lot to explore.
For rebellion is like the sin of divination. Mm-hmm. There's a lot there. And then also arrogance or presumption is another translation, or stubbornness. Mm-hmm. Those three is as idolatry. Mm-hmm. That's interesting.
Yeah, so Saul has decided to rebel against God. He has decided to not obey. And they're like, you basically are divining then. You're basically looking at other avenues for your wisdom. God has given you a clear word and you've rejected that word. And now you're looking for other things that you can do.
That's right.
Like
because
divination.
divining was like when you would roll a dice and it would tell you where to go.
Yeah.
The process of decision making.
Yeah. Livers or whatever. It was decision making, but via spirits and
That's right.
pagan
So here,
idols.
what's contrasted here is that the rebellion through arrogance, presumptuousness, or stubbornness is divination.
Yeah.
So it's like, and then idolatry is like that presumptuousness of putting yourself first. So by idolatry, putting yourself first, you're committing adultery and rebelling against God in the process.
Yeah, and it makes sense. Like Saul having the arrogance to think that his word is better than God's word. His idea, his plan's better than God's plan.
Right.
God wants me to just burn it all to the ground right there. No. I want to save it, bring it to the tent tabernacle and burn it to it. That's a better idea.
Right.
Saul's putting his ideas above God's, meaning he is above God.
Right.
Therefore, it's idolatry.
Right.
He's the idol. And that's why, you'll hear a lot of pastors and a lot of Christians talking about today that we as human beings, as Christians, can still be engaged in idolatry and divination, even though it doesn't look like a physical idol, or doesn't look like we're physically trying to read tea leaves or read our horoscopes. We can still be doing that based off of verses like this. Rebellion is like the sin of divination, and arrogance like the evil of idolatry.
Right.
Scary stuff.
It is.
Yeah.
And especially
Cuts
for Israel,
to the heart.
who put Saul to the top and were treated like an idol, as we talked about last week. It's really interesting.
So in the end of chapter 15, there's a note that Samuel now will not see Saul again. So this is the end of their relationship, but he mourns for him and prays for him. So it marks an end of their relationship. 1 Samuel chapter 16, Samuel then anoints David as king. And David, through a series of interesting events, he goes into King Saul's service as a musician and armor bearer to Saul. And this is because we're told that a tormenting spirit, God sends a tormenting spirit to Saul after the spirit of God leaves Saul. So Saul's still king, but now he's not empowered by the spirit of God to accomplish his mission. And so now he's just tormented. And David's music as a musician helps him relax and helps him calm down. So David, as a young man, goes into Saul's service, though it appears that Saul doesn't really pay him too much attention at first.
Well, specifically, too, is that he is anointed and he gets rushed with the Spirit. And that is what comes before.
Calm Saul.
That's right. That's what helps calm Saul. Because, Saul doesn't have that anymore.
Yeah.
Also to be recognized here is that these prophecies are now being fulfilled in this chapter. Specific prophecies from Genesis 17, verse 6, and verse 16, and Genesis 35, verse 11, which said that a king would come through your descendants.
Right.
Right? And then it's also even more harnessed down when we read, a scepter will rise out of Israel and not depart from Judah. When you mix Jacob's prophecy in Genesis 49, verse 10, and Balaam's prophecy in Numbers 24, verse 17. So you have this thing where a king is going to be born, but it'll come out of, stay in Judah, right? And it'll be in Israel. And this is done through David. So this is the beginning of those prophecies being fulfilled.
So just to clarify, Saul's family was the tribe of Benjamin. David's family is the tribe of Judah.
That's right. So these are all being fulfilled through David, right? That's right.
Okay, 1 Samuel chapter 17. So this is the famous David and Goliath, okay? So the Philistine army and the Israelite army are camped in the valley of Elah, and the Philistines have this warrior named Goliath who is extremely tall and extremely strong. And so they've proposed, Goliath is a giant from Gath, and they've proposed that this battle be settled by a tournament of warriors. So essentially, their best warrior, Goliath, against Israel's best warrior, and whoever wins the battle, and the other nation will serve, the losing nation will serve the winning nation. So we know at this point that young David was already in the part-time employment of King Saul, right? In verse 15 tells us that David was coming and going between Saul and his father's sheep, because again, back in chapter 16, we learned that David's music, David had been anointed by God to be the king, so he had the Spirit of God, but his music was able to calm Saul down whenever he would go into a fit or
whatever it is.
Off on a tangent.
Yeah.
So David ends up being allowed to fight Goliath, likely because of his standing already with Saul as a spiritual man, perhaps even a prophet, because we know from elsewhere in the Bible, some prophets used music.
Right.
So anyway, David, through a really interesting sequence of events, ends up being able to fight Goliath, even though he's not a warrior. And he ends up defeating Goliath with a sling, which is ironic because Saul, as a Benjamite, the Benjamites are known for their power with a sling.
Yeah.
So there's a little bit of irony there.
Yes.
The very weapon that Saul would have been trained in and good in, David, as a child, defeats.
Yes.
Or as a young man, but not a warrior, defeats this massive.
That is ironic.
Yeah.
And I will say this, if there wasn't that like beautiful gem of Ruth in between Judges and Samuel, like how it traditionally was, where it was just Judges, then comes to Samuel, David would have been, if you look at it just as a narrative structure, it's been cycles of sin. This is like the moment of fresh air.
Yeah.
That you would have being like, there's actually someone.
Here comes someone.
Here comes
like
someone.
Following Samuel.
That's
Samuel's
right.
good too, but yeah.
Yeah, no, I know what you're saying, but this is someone who's different, right?
Yeah.
From his youth, and it's really nice. It's a breath of fresh air.
Yeah.
In a political sense, but yeah.
So something that normally doesn't make it into the kids' versions of David and Goliath is that David chops off the head from Goliath's body, and he brings Goliath's head to Jerusalem. David comes from Bethlehem, not Jerusalem. Jerusalem's not an Israelite city at this point, so it's interesting there. Maybe we'll talk about that when we get into David's life.
Okay.
But David then keeps Goliath's weapons in his own tent. And it's Saul, at this point, Saul starts to take more of an interest in David's family.
Yeah.
He's now locked himself into a family covenant with David's family because he said, whoever defeats Goliath, I'll give my daughter in marriage to.
Right.
So now he's like,
Yeah.
Who is this kid really? Like, who is this kid really?
Jonathan's like floored. He's like, I love this guy.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's just
They become best buds real quick.
Buddy cops. Anyway, sorry.
Okay, 1 Samuel chapter 18. So Saul decides to keep David on full time. Obviously, he's the hero of Israel at this point. And so Jonathan, who we find out later on in some of these chapters, Jonathan is the crowned prince of Israel. So it is Saul's intention to pass the throne of Israel on to Jonathan, okay? But Jonathan goes out on his own and he makes a covenant with David. Jonathan gives David his royal clothing and all of his weapons. So this, in the ancient world, would have been seen as a transfer of authority. Most likely, more than likely, meaning that Jonathan is yielding his crown prince status to David. So Jonathan's like, I'm not anointed to be the next king of Israel. You clearly are anointed to be the next king of Israel, and I support you.
Right.
You will be the king of Israel. David is a really successful warrior, and he raises up the ranks very quickly, we're told here in chapter 18. Then Saul turns against David because David is very obviously super popular with the people and very successful.
Saul has slain thousands, but David has slain tens of thousands.
Yeah, because remember, Saul's already being tormented. Like he's got this paranoia going.
Yeah.
He's got this complex going, and now it's being agitated.
Yeah.
David marries Michal, who is Saul's younger daughter. In 1 Samuel chapter 19, Jonathan has to convince his father Saul not to kill David, but eventually Saul tries to kill David anyway in sudden outbursts. He's trying to spear him with his spear against the wall, but David escapes, and Michal, as David's wife, helps David escape the city. So we're told that David goes and he stays with the prophet Samuel in the city of Ramah, and Saul sends men to go get David from Samuel, but each man that he sends ends up being overcome with the Spirit of God and prophesying with Samuel's men. And Samuel's men are prophets. So the first set of men, and then the second set of men, and then Saul himself here in chapter 19 comes, and he too starts prophesying along the way. And when he gets there to Samuel, he strips off all his clothes and he keeps prophesying in Samuel's presence.
So why is that?
Right. Okay, so there's this really amazing theme of clothing that goes throughout the entire narrative of Samuel, Saul, and David. And clothing in the ancient world was really important, and it could symbolize your very presence, definitely symbolize your rank and your authority. Right. So just as Jonathan taking off his clothes and giving them to David, he's saying, I am no longer the crown prince. You are clearly God's crown prince. Saul stripping off his royal robes is an acknowledgement that the authority of the kingdom is no longer his. Right. In the presence of God, when he's prophesying, because the presence of God has fallen on him, in the presence of God, the authority of the kingship of Israel is no longer his.
That symbol of clothing also carries over to the adoption of sonship, where we will wear white linen. Clothing is the concept there that's applied. So you're being clothed in righteousness, right? Clothed in salvation. That's the same sense that you're now a status among,
you're
under
now
Christ.
A child of God.
Child of God, right. Yeah. That's interesting. So
and the New Testament even talks about how we wear Christ like a robe.
Right.
His righteousness becomes our righteousness, not because we deserve it, not because it's our clothing, but because it's his. So there's a huge, huge theme throughout the Bible of clothing.
Right. Okay, cool.
And what it represents.
And I'm sure there's a lot there more to explore, but that's good.
Oh, yeah. I love it.
Yeah.
Okay. 1 Samuel chapter 20, David and Jonathan, they come up with a ruse, a test to see if Saul is still planning on killing David, because he's tricky. Saul goes back and forth. Seems pretty bipolar, honestly.
Yeah.
And then there's this covenant made between the house of David and the house of Jonathan. Essentially, David is always going to treat the descendants of Jonathan with respect and with care, no matter what Saul does. So, in verse 31 of chapter 20, Saul ends up cursing his son Jonathan for helping David. And he says, as long as the son of Jesse lives on this earth, neither you nor your kingdom will be established. He must die. So we see here, again, Saul's like, what are you doing? This is your kingdom.
Yeah.
You are the crown prince. Fight for it. And Jonathan's like, I'm not.
Yeah.
God is king. He's already chosen. Who am I to stand in the way?
Yeah.
So Jonathan's awesome.
Yeah, and he's amazing. Yeah.
Unsung hero, man.
I know, he really is.
Died too early. We're going to get there. Okay, 1 Samuel chapter 21. David is traveling. He had to leave because Saul is clearly trying to kill him. So he ends up traveling with men who are loyal to him. So some of the military left with him. He stops at a place called Nob, where there is a priestly sanctuary. And the priest of Nob gives David and these men the old consecrated bread. So the bread of the presence that, they had to take it out of the presence of God and replace it with new bread of the presence. They allow David and his men to eat that consecrated bread, even though it was just supposed to be for the priests, because they need to keep David alive.
Christ references this.
Yes. And they give Goliath's sword. So David must have donated Goliath's sword to the sanctuary at some point. So they give it back to David. So David then, interestingly, goes to Goliath's hometown of Gath, but he instantly regrets his decision because he's obviously recognized by the officials there.
Right.
So David ends up pretending to be insane, like Saul. Right? This is probably believable because everyone's probably talking about how crazy Saul is.
Yeah.
So he pretends to be insane, therefore he's not a threat.
Right.
He's no longer a threat. Like, look how far this hero has fallen.
Yeah.
1 Samuel chapter 22, David's father's household and all of his brothers, they come to him while he's living in the wilderness at a place called the Cave of Adullam. So apparently it wasn't even safe for David's closer relatives to just be out in the open. That's how badly Saul wanted to kill him. So they were afraid that Saul was going to kill them on account of David. And we learned that at this point, there's a little bit of a rebellion that goes on. 400 men who are not happy with Saul's reign, they come and meet up with David. So David ends up making an agreement with the king of Moab for his parents and his family to stay there. So now they're refugees. They're living in Moab, not even in Israel anymore. a prophet named Gad, meets David and tells him where to go. This is where you need to go to avoid Saul now. So David has a very interesting band of loyal people around him. Unfortunately, in the end of chapter 22, we also read about how King Saul massacres the priests at Nob because he learns that they helped David. And then he goes beyond and he massacres the civilian population of the city of Nob.
Yeah.
Now, it's interesting to note that Saul's men actually wouldn't go through with it. They were like, no way, we can't kill the priests of God.
Yeah.
So that's something. But Saul had an Edomite, so he had people who were not Israelite in his army.
Yes.
And they did it.
Yeah.
The foreigners in Saul's service would do it. It's interesting that the Israelite soldiers didn't try to stop them. They just let it happen. But one priest of Nob named Abiathar, he escapes and he goes to live with David.
Yes, and he's around for a while.
Yes.
All right.
A long while. Okay, 1 Samuel chapter 23, David saves the city of Keilah from the Philistines. Keilah is a town that belongs to the tribe of Judah, right? David's family. Saul tries to trap David there, but David escapes, and now he's really on the run. Like Saul's in hot pursuit, and it's place to place to place to place. We learn that David and Jonathan had a plan where David was going to be the king and Jonathan was going to be his second in command. So perhaps the commander of the army.
Right.
We learned that. David gets betrayed to Saul by a certain people group. And also David writes Psalm 54 at this point, which is just an interesting. This is when he writes Psalm 54.
Right.
It's a fun thing to read when you're reading this part. So if you want to stop and jump ahead and read Psalm 54, there it is. Okay. Saul gets sidetracked because the Philistines invade Israel again. They attack. So in chapter 24, after this battle is complete, Saul is tipped off that David is living in the desert oasis of En-Gedi, which you can still visit today. Still go there.
Oh, cool.
It's really pretty. So this is when Saul goes, this is the famous story when Saul goes into the cave to go to the washroom. But David and his men are hiding out in this cave in En-Gedi. Right. There's a lot of caves in En-Gedi. And David won't let any of his men hurt Saul. But he decides, as proof that he's not going to kill Saul, to cut off a piece of his robe hem.
Right.
But then David instantly regrets it.
Right. He is conscience-stricken, it says. So with that, we know earlier that when Saul was disappointed as king, he leaned to Samuel and he grabbed and ripped his robe as well. So to tie back to this idea of clothing, what does this cutting of the robe mean specifically?
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
So again, in the ancient world, if you were a person of stature, so if you were a priest or prophet, or if you were king, your clothing symbolized your authority.
Right.
And often the hems of robes would be very decorated. We even see this in early Israelite history. So for example, the hem of the robe of the high priest was decorated with golden bells and pomegranates, right? Yeah. Which has a symbolism all in and of itself. But when Saul fell and he ripped the hem off of Samuel's robe, Samuel turns around and he goes, so God has ripped the kingdom from you.
Right.
So you've tried to rip my authority, but all you've done.
Right.
So in that situation, what's really cool about that is Saul tried to usurp Samuel's authority by offering the sacrifice.
Right.
So then by falling and ripping the hem of his robe, Samuel's like, you've tried to take my authority from me.
Right.
Both actually and now symbolically in tearing my hem by accident, but God has actually taken away your authority. And so it's the same here where David hasn't totally torn away, but he said, see, I could tear away your authority, but I'm not going to take your life.
Right. But it also shows that David specifically is showing that Saul is no longer the king. Like he's trying to say it softly as he can, right, by doing that. But because he even regrets this decision, right, because of the symbol that comes with it.
Yeah. Well, and then David even says, he goes, may the Lord judge between you and me, and may the Lord avenge the wrongs you have done to me, but my hand will not touch you. As the old saying goes, from evildoers come evil deeds, so my hand will not touch you.
Right.
He wanted nothing to do with that.
Yeah.
He did not want to be evil. He did not want to be vengeful. He
Right.
did not want to kill Saul.
Right.
And he promises that he's not going to kill Saul's family. And
Yeah.
I've always wondered, if this is because David got a front row seat right after he was anointed king of Israel. He got a front row seat to what happens when the king of Israel stops following God.
That's right.
And it's bad.
Yeah.
It was bad.
It was.
He saw the Spirit of God leave. He saw the results of the Spirit of God leaving Saul. And it was Saul going into fits of rage and insanity. And so that would have been a very harsh thing to see as someone who was just anointed the next king of Israel.
Yeah.
Like, you're only the second king of Israel, and this is what happened to the first king of Israel.
Yeah.
So David's got a lot on his mind, and it's played about, okay, this is potentially me.
And to add more to this, because he goes his whole life, like he gets pushed out of Israel. He becomes like a wanderer and like a bandit essentially, because he will not take Saul's life. Like he goes beyond, over and above what it means to preserve God's anointed.
Yeah.
And if you think about that with what you're saying here, what he sees himself in Saul, how could he? Justice demands that he can't. If you have a sense of justice about you, how could you kill someone that you see yourself in?
Yeah.
Right?
So I can easily become this.
That's right. So it actually shows where his heart lies.
Yeah.
Completely.
His whole thing is, God anointed you, God needs to remove you.
That's right.
If God, and that's what he wants for himself too. Like, if God anointed me, I want God to remove me.
That's right. It's a strong sense of justice. It's interesting.
Okay. So 1 Samuel chapter 25, there's a record of Samuel's death and burial at his hometown of Ramah. And then we have this really interesting story of Nabal and Abigail. So these are very wealthy Calebites. So from the family of Caleb, and they own the territory around the city of Hebron. And clearly Nabal, the husband, is a supporter of Saul, because when David comes and asks for help, he refuses to help David and his men. And the quote is this: "Many servants are breaking away from their masters these days." So in other words, you're servant of Saul and you're in the wrong. You have broken away from that. Now, this was culturally a very unacceptable thing to do, to refuse help or to refuse payment to someone who has actively protected your livelihood, because David and his men had protected Nabal's herds and shepherds. And so as a result, David's asking for hospitality in return.
Right.
So what should have happened culturally was Nabal, even if he disagreed with him politically, would be like, of course, here's some food. Thank you for saving my livelihood. Right. But that's not what happens. He insults David. So David's like, all right, well, I'm going to have to kill you. Like, I'm going to have to take this over. This is battle. This is war. And Nabal's wife, Abigail, intercedes, and David changes his mind. And she plays the best card that she could have with David, where she's like, why would you bring blood on your hands needlessly?
Right.
And David's like, oh, like that's his language.
Yeah.
He has just said to Saul, evil deeds come from the hands of evildoers.
That's right.
And I don't want to be an evildoer. Nabal ends up dying 10 days later. So God judges Nabal. And we also learn that David has 2 wives now besides Michal. Both are from the tribe of Judah and probably very prominent families. It really, this is where we start to get the intimation that David's trying to secure a base of allegiance within his own tribe. Right. So doing this through marriage, doing this through allyship.
Is his first big blunder.
Yeah.
Because this is the steady decline of his for so many things. Like this is where it begins. Deuteronomy 17, do not multiply wives.
Yeah.
To paraphrase it.
Yeah.
So and this is what it was Abigail, who's wise.
He ends up marrying Abigail.
Yeah. Right. So and anyways, so
but
starts right here.
He shouldn't have done it.
No.
He shouldn't have done it. But it would have seemed like a really smart thing to do, humanly speaking, because he's on the run. He needs alliances, powerful, rich alliances.
That's right.
And that's what he's trying to do.
Saul, his father-in-law hates him to death.
Yep.
So he's probably thinking that Michal's gone. Like he's probably has all these things across his mind.
And Michal was gone.
Yeah.
Because we learn also in the end of verse chapter 25 that Michal, Saul remarried her to a man in the tribe of Benjamin.
Right.
So essentially, this takes away a claim to the throne of Israel from David.
Right.
Because David would say, well, my first wife is Michal, the first king of Israel's daughter.
Right.
I have a wife of royal blood.
Right.
So Saul's like, not anymore.
Right.
So he remarries her to someone in the tribe of Judah. Benjamin, sorry.
Right. So and here we go. The problem starts.
Here we
now.
go. The problems. Okay, 1 Samuel chapter 26. People named the Ziphites, they rat on David again to Saul. And David and his nephew Abishai sneak into Saul's camp and they steal Saul's spear and water jug, and then they confront him. Again, like, see, if we wanted to kill you, we would have just killed you. In chapter 27, David and his men get their families back because their families were stolen in warfare. And they end up going back to the city of Gath. The king of Gath then gives David and his men the city of Ziklag. And this becomes an Israelite city. They live there for a year. From Ziklag, they go out and they raid enemy territory, but they kill everyone. So essentially, they're living in Philistine territory on good faith, but they're going out and they're killing Philistine villages and towns, but they're killing everyone so that the Philistines don't know that they're secretly sabotaging the Philistines. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense.
Okay. In chapter 28, the Philistines go to war against Israel again. Saul uses a medium who lives in Endor to summon Samuel's spirit after the normal methods of inquiring after God fail. So offering sacrifices doesn't work. Looking at asking prophets doesn't work. Using the Urim and Thummim doesn't work. So God is not talking to Saul at this point. So he goes through a medium. And the message to Saul is, tomorrow you die and David's going to be king. In chapter 29, the Philistine commanders, so the Philistines are going out to war, and David is like, I'm going to war with you. And the commanders are like, no way will we allow you as Hebrews to fight against other Hebrews. The king trusts David, but none of the Philistine commanders trust David.
Right.
I mean, for good reason.
Yeah, makes sense.
In chapter 30, David returns to Ziklag, and the Amalekites had raided and stolen everything from Ziklag. And this is where David experiences a mutiny of his own. The men talk about stoning David, but instead, on the advice of God through Abiathar the priest, David leads them in war. He's like, no, we're going to go. We're going to get the Amalekites. It's going to be fine. And they did. They got their families back. We also see David again trying to strengthen ties with the tribe of Judah. He sends them tribute from his war. So to all the prominent families in the tribe of Judah, David sends them gifts of warfare. So he's trying to butter them up. He's like, see? Chapter 31, Saul, Jonathan, and Saul's other sons die in battle on Mount Gilboa. And there's a note here that says when the Israelites around that area realize what had happened, they end up abandoning the cities. They just leave. But then the Philistines occupy that territory. So Israel has lost a chunk of territory now to the Philistines. The bodies of Saul and the princes were hung up on the wall of Bethshen as a shame to Israel and to the royal family. And Saul's armor, his royal armor, was set up in a Philistine temple. The men of Jabesh Gilead, do you remember Jabesh Gilead,
yes,
that at the beginning of Saul's reign he saved?
Yeah.
They go on this potential suicide mission to save the bodies of Saul and his sons, but they win. They are able to take the bodies and they burn them. They were probably pretty decomposed.
Yes.
So they burn them by cremation and then they bury the remains.
Right.
All right. A few more chapters into 2 Samuel, and then we'll be done for this week. 2 Samuel chapter 1, David hears about the death of Saul and his family from an Amalekite who was a member of Saul's army. This Amalekite claims to have finished Saul off at his request. And so he had brought Saul's crown and armband. Apparently he had a royal armband to David. And David, like thinking that he was going to get a reward or something, this Amalekite. But David ends up executing the man for killing Saul. And then he mourns for Saul and Jonathan. So we see David mourning for his enemy.
That's right.
But then also for Jonathan, he would have been very sad.
So ends the bromance between the two.
The best buds, right? Okay, 2 Samuel chapter 2, David moves back into Judah, specifically to the city of Hebron. There's a lot of history with Hebron. It's a good place to look up in a biblical dictionary. And the tribal leaders of Judah that David has sent presents to, they come and they crown him the king of Judah, the king of the tribe of Judah. However, not all of Israel is on board with this because we learned that the army commander of Saul sets up the son of Saul named Ishbosheth, who didn't die, as king over the rest of Israel. Now, then begins a sort of civil war between Saul's family and the Israelites loyal to Saul and David and the tribe of Judah. So the commander of David's army, whose name is Joab, who's also David's nephew, he meets Ishbosheth's army at the pool of Gibeon for a contest of arms. And when they tie, when their warriors kill each other, battle breaks out. And Saul's side, or Ishbosheth's side, loses and they're on the run. So we're told that Joab and his brother Abishai, who we've met before, and Asahel, I'm probably saying that wrong, but they've been part of David's military and they're his nephews. They're the sons of his sister. Asahel will not stop chasing the Israelite commander of the army, of Ishbosheth's army. And apparently Ashael's unarmed, even though he's chasing this man. And he gets killed by the commander of Ishbosheth's army, who's named Abner. And the battle's ended because everyone's just floored that Asahel has been killed.
Right.
Chapter 3, we learn of 4 more wives of David. Dude.
Steady decline. Yeah.
We know that the first 2 wives, other than Michal, were likely to secure relationships with Judah to get that kingship, right? But then one of David's wife was a princess of Geshur, which is a really important territory, and so represents a treaty, an allyship with them. We learned that the commander of Saul's army, Abner, had been strengthening his position in Saul's household. So he's probably looking to take over from Ishbosheth, like this king. But he gets called out on it and he defects to David, which is really interesting. So now David has this man who was loyal to Saul's house and now he's claiming to be loyal to David. So there's all this political intrigue, dangerous military intrigue that's going on. Is Abner going to kill David or is Abner going to serve David? We don't really know. We also are told that David takes Michal back. He takes her away from her Benjamite husband because, again, David is trying to secure his throne. So this makes sense. This is his claim to the throne of Saul. Right? So then this man, Abner, who's deflected from Saul and is living with David, he begins brokering, trying to solidify a takeover of all Israel for David. But Joab, who's the commander of David's army, does not trust Abner. Remember, Abner just killed his little brother. Killed Joab's little brother, who was unarmed. And he doesn't trust Abner's motives. He thinks that Abner is going to kill David. So Joab kills Abner.
But then David holds Joab accountable for his whole life because of this.
Oh, yeah. Hard. Because imagine if David had supported Joab, all of Israel who loved Abner would have hated David. So David's like, who am I going to... how am I going to deal with this? It's a political nightmare for David.
Even more than politically, he tells Solomon, he's like, look, don't trust Joab. He just says that. And that, so ends Joab then. But it actually deeply affects this whole act that Joab does.
Yes.
He goes, it's out of revenge, but it was a time of war, which it's a different contract, I guess David would say.
Well, yeah, because, well, that is true. David holds Joab to a standard that he doesn't hold anyone else to.
Right.
When you do some research into it, where you do how did David handle other people killing people in a time of warfare? It's strictly because Joab threatened David's rule just as it was getting started.
Right.
In terms of David almost had all of Israel, and Joab put that all on the line. So David needed someone to blame.
Right. And then he actually, But it's a deeper conflict.
It's a deep conflict. Okay. So chapter 4, 2 men end up assassinating Ishbosheth, that rival king in Israel, and they take his head to David. But David, you don't execute royal family.
Right.
To David. David executes those assassins. David learns that Jonathan has a surviving son. But he's crippled. Lost the use of his feet or his ankles because they got broken in while they were fleeing from battle, and they healed incorrectly. And this son's name is Mephibosheth, and David treats him very well.
Yes.
In 2 Samuel chapter 5, David finally manages to become king over all of Israel. He conquers Jerusalem for the new capital city, which we learn later on it's Joab that captures the city for David. And he earns back his role as commander of the army.
Right.
That's how Joab gets it back. And there's a record of David defeating the Philistines. In chapter 6, David tries to bring the Ark of the Covenant from Kiriath-Jearim to Jerusalem. I say try because it fails miserably because they're not following the law of God. They put it on a cart. The cart starts to fall. A guy tries to stop the Ark of the Covenant from falling, but you're not allowed to touch the Ark of the Covenant, and he ends up dying, and everyone's scared. It's not a good situation. There's also this very bitter interaction between Michal and David, and it ends with Michal having no children to the day of her death. So some people take this as a punishment that God made her barren, but it's just as likely that David and Michal just never consummated their remarriage.
There's a reason for
they were never intimate again.
Right. There's a practical reason for this too. It says, okay, I'm just going to read it in verse 16. Then verses 20 and 23. I'll just read it all as one.
Sure.
As the ark of the Lord came into the city of David, Michal, the daughter of Saul, looked out the window and saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, and she despised him in her heart. And David returned to bless his household. But Michal, the daughter of Saul, came out to meet David and said, how the king of Israel honored himself today, pretty cynical, uncovering himself today before the eyes of his female servants, as one of the vulgar fellows shamelessly uncovers himself. And David said to Michal, it was before the Lord who chose me above your father and above all his house to appoint me as prince over Israel, the people of the Lord, and I will celebrate before the Lord. I will make myself yet more contemptible than this, and I will be abased in your eyes. But by the female servants of whom you have spoken, by them I shall be held in honor. And then it says they never had a child, after that. So the point here is that I think people are like, oh, Michal, how could she say anything? It's not at all what's happening here. As we talked about, there's a steady decline in moral perspective with David not introspecting about his decisions, especially in this sense. So Michal, he's basically uncovering himself actually in a way that's not favorable for a king. But go ahead.
Okay, yes. But there's something that we always miss here.
Go ahead.
So there's this whole thing where we're like, David was dancing naked before the people. That's not actually what happened. Michal accuses him of being uncovered, of being naked.
Yes.
But we're told in the earlier verses that he's wearing a Levitical robe.
Right.
He is wearing what all the other Levites were wearing. The Levites were not allowed to be naked. They had to wear undergarments underneath their robe. That was a rule for them.
Yeah.
So what does she mean? Well, it says before the festival, David stripped off his kingly robes and he put on a priestly robe.
Right.
Like a humble priestly robe, not like a high priestly robe. And he danced in the procession of the Ark of the Covenant. Now, Michal has just been taken from her new husband
Right.
strictly so David can solidify his claim to the throne.
Right.
Then, when they're bringing the ark in, he takes off his claim of kingship like it's nothing,
Right.
and he's dancing with the commoners in the street.
Right.
So from Michal's perspective,
Yeah.
you stole my life
Right.
to solidify your kingship, and then you treat your kingship with contempt so you can dance with the slave girls?
Right.
Right?
No, yeah, it's completely,
So
yeah.
you're like, oh, when you,
Right.
it's so much more interesting when you look at the human dynamic. Not saying that she was right at all.
Right.
But what she's not accusing him of being naked. She's accusing him of treating the kingship with contempt.
Right.
And he's saying, because I'm not really the king, God decides. God decides. But
Right.
then she's like, but then why do you need me?
Right.
And there's a point there.
No, yeah, right. And there's a point there. So this is kind of like David is essentially, I don't want to say confused because he's not confused, but he's essentially kind of being a hypocrite a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's the whole multiple wives thing. He is breaking the law.
That's
of God.
right. And that's why. So this is
rough.
Is steady steady decline in his moral perspective.
Rough stuff.
Right. So anyways, just want to point that out here. That Michal
so
wasn't solely to blame in this case.
Yes.
Is what I'm trying to say, right? This is there's a bigger issue happening.
There's a bigger picture.
Yeah.
Okay, last chapter, chapter 7, we're just going to mention it. David wants to build a temple for God because he's all comfortable in his new Jerusalem palace. But God says, no, you're a man of war. You are not fit to build me a house. In fact, I'm going to build you a house, a dynasty, right? So there's this Davidic covenant that happens. We call it the Davidic covenant. It's a covenant between God and David that God will build David an everlasting dynasty.
Right.
And that's that.
That's that.
Anything else before we sign off?
No, I think that's good. We can cover it next week.
We can. Okay. Yeah. Leave your comments and your questions, your disagreements or your agreements or whatever down in the comments below. We love reading them, and I hope you have a really great week studying the Bible.
Thank you so much for watching. We want to keep producing high-quality biblical content, but we can't do it without your support. If you feel called to support us, please click the link in the description under Donate. Your support really means a lot to us.